Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Juta Padakamalam Sri Gurun.
Mantra Guru Ajoto Shikha Gurgan Ta Chorane Age Koriya Bandhan Vancha Kalpa Turubhishtu Kripasindu Vevacha Paditanam Pavaneva Vaishnava Namo Namaha Oma Gyana Timananda Sagyana Jana Shalakaya Chukshu Unmulitam Jen Tasma Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Shami Iti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Prashchatta Deshatarine. In his concluding purport to the 14th chapter, text 14.26, Srila Prabhupada writes, in his constitutional position, a living entity is above the three modes of material nature, but association with material nature entangles him in the different modes of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. Due to the association of these three modes, his desire to dominate the material world is there. By engagement in devotional service and full Krishna consciousness, he is immediately situated in the transcendental position, and his unlawful desire to control material nature is removed. In this purport, Srila Prabhupada, practically speaking, he summarizes the 14th chapter by explaining that the Purusha, again referring back to the key verse, which we could actually consider the verse we analyzed in the previous lesson, 13:22, Purusha Prakritishto Hi Bhunkte Prakriti Jangonan Karanam Gunasanga Asyad Sarasad Yoni Janmashu. In this verse, we could consider this verse as a seed verse for the subsequent 5 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, because this verse is explaining the essential issue that the transcendental jiva, Purusha, Prakritishto, is situated in the material energy. And why he's situated there is because Bhunkte, Gunan, he's enjoying the modes of material nature, which are Prakritijan, which are fundamentally the components of the material nature. And in this way, as a result of full immersion in enjoying the modes, tamas chavi bhuya sattam bhavati bharata, sometimes the mode of goodness becomes predominant. Raja sattam tami bhuya, sometimes the mode of passion becomes predominant. Tama raja sattam taiva, sometimes the mode of ignorance becomes predominant. And in this way, a living entity simply takes shelter and enjoys the opportunities which are provided by the three modes of material nature, and in this way completely immerses himself in illusory existence. Prakritishto. This is the bewildered condition. Karanam Gunasanga, and as a result of the enjoyment that the jiva experiences through associating with the modes, Sadasad Yoni Janmashu, one becomes conditioned to the material nature. One becomes, condemned to taking birth. And we can analyze the various modes of material nature according to different symptoms. Krishna was explaining that in the mode of goodness one is satisfied and one has knowledge. In the mode of passion one is always desiring, fulfilling goals. And in the mode of ignorance one is simply not concerned about anything at all. And in this way we can identify the different manner in which the material nature is influencing us. And Prabhupada goes on to explain that by engagement in devotional service and full Krishna consciousness, he is immediately situated in the transcendental position. Mam chayo vyabhacharina bhakti yogena sevate. By connecting bhakti yogena, by the devotional yoga process of serving Sri Hari, loving Sri Hari, chanting the name of Sri Hari, wearing the marks of Sri Hari on one's forehead and body, wearing the beads indicating what one is a servant of Sri Hari, hearing the glories of Sri Hari, making offerings to the murti of Sri Hari, bowing down and chanting the mantras in glorification of Sri Hari, cooking for the saviour, etc. There's devotional practice by in this way we're directly associating with Sri Hari, by connecting through the seva with love, then, which is very natural for the soul and very joyful for the soul. Then one associates with Sri Hari, and by virtue of one's position of close proximity with Sri Hari via association, then one can transcend the modes of material nature, as Sri Hari himself is in a transcendental position. So this is the practice of Bhakti Yoga, as Krishna himself recommends in the 14th chapter. Let's take a look at an overview of the 15th chapter. We'll see in the first 5 verses the analogy of the banyan tree is presented by Sri Krishna. And then verses 6 to 11 give some further detail in a very scientific and graphic manner of how the soul transmigrates from one body to another in the material world. Krishna, as the maintainer and in summary of the Vedanta, conclude this 20 verses which constitute the shortest chapter of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So in verses 1 to 5, Krishna gives an analogy of a banyan tree. Let's read some of the verses. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Udvamulam Adashakam Ashvatam Praha Abhyayam Chandang Kshiyarsha Paranani Yastam Veda Savedavit. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is said that there is an imperishable banyan tree that has its roots upward and its branches down, and whose leaves are the Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is to know the Vedas." In the subsequent verses, Krishna goes on to explain more detail in regard to this analogy. Let's read some of these translations as we view the diagram. The branches of this tree extend downward and upward, nourished by the 3 modes of material nature. The twigs are the objects of the senses. This tree has its roots going down, and those are bound to the fruitive actions of human society. The real form of the tree cannot be perceived in this world. No one can understand where it ends, where it begins, or where its foundation is. But with determination, one must cut down this strongly rooted tree, and with the weapons of detachment. Thereafter, one must seek that place from which, having gone, one never returns, and there surrender to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom everything began and from everything has extended since time immemorial. Very inspirational verses. Krishna here is speaking to inspire us to extricate ourselves from this material. Srila Prabhupada comments in a very humorous way on the very graphic example of the banyan tree. Urdhva Moolam. Just like if you have to keep yourself, the legs are up and the head is down. Somebody keeps you like this. How long will you feel comfortable? Prabhupada's giving the example of you're being held upside down by your legs. If someone takes your legs and catches you, your head down, then it is not very comfortable. So this whole material world is like that. Urdhva Moolam. The Moolam should have been down, but it is up. Therefore, it is uncomfortable. So in this way, Srila Prabhupada is alluding to the actual reality that we find in this material world, that no matter how successful we may be materially, we are inherently in an uncomfortable position here, being the eternal soul, having become conditioned by and entrapped by the prison of this material world, and therefore our true and our full spiritual capacity cannot be enjoyed in the material world. And we're in a very awkward circumstance. And Srila Prabhupada is alluding to that principle and referring to this aspect of the banyan tree analogy, that the roots are upward and the branches are downward. Another explanation is the perverted reflection. So Prabhupada is giving the example that the tree on the bank of the pond can be seen in the reflection of the tree, is the opposite reflection of the tree in the pond. It appears to be the tree, but actually it's just the reflection of the tree, perverted reflection. So in this way, the material world reflects the spiritual reality, but it cannot be the spiritual reality. It's only a reflection or a perversion of the spiritual reality. On the bank of the river or the bank of the pond, there is a tree standing, but the reflection, we find that the same tree has become urdhva mulam, adha shakam. The roots will be going up, and the branches will be going down. Adha shaka, branches going down. Urdhva mulam, roots going up. So by this statement, Krishna says that this is not real. That reflection in the water of the tree, it is not real. Real tree is up. Similarly, real enjoyment, real variety, everything is in the spiritual world. It is simply reflection in the material world. It is not a fact. Therefore, our enjoyment here is called maya or illusion. Let's just delete all that, everything that we did the first version, delete it, that verse I read, because I've got it here, so we'll do it with the slides. You can keep the slide on, and I'm reading, beginning now. Let's carry on with text number 5. After explaining the actual circumstance of Purusha Prakriti Shto, what it means like for the living entity to be in the material world. First Krishna in chapter 14 has explained it in terms of the bumping together and the pulling of the modes of material nature, which bind the soul, which cause the soul again to be thrown in the material world, either in a higher or a middle or a lower place of birth in the subsequent life. In a very scientific way from the aspect of the modes of material nature. And in this chapter, Krishna is explaining it first with a graphic and an analogy to help the listener of Srimad Bhagavad Gita to understand that being in this Prakriti Shto, being in this material world, is not the place where we are actually meant to be. And the so-called happiness and enjoyment that we witness in this world is simply a poor and very much unsatisfying reflection of the actual spiritual happiness and variety available in the spiritual world. And now Krishna, in text number 5, having established this graphic analogy to help us realize our actual position, in text number 5, Krishna now explains what is the process, in the general principle, or the general qualifications required for the living entity who aspires to extricate himself from the illusion of the material existence. Nirmana moha jita shanga dosha adyatma nitya vinibhrutta kama Tvandavayur vimukta shukha dhoka shagyair kachchanya mudha padamabhyayam tat. Krishna is explaining in text number 5, those who are free from false prestige, nirmana moha, illusion and false association, jita shanga dosha, who understand the eternal, adhyatma nitya, who are done with material lust, vinivitta kanamai, who are free from duality of happiness and distress, understand and know how to surrender under the Supreme Personality of Godhead, attain to that eternal kingdom. And Prabhupada, in his purport, comments, to get out of the entanglement of the strong material banyan tree, the material life, one must surrender to Krishna. As soon as one surrenders to Krishna, one becomes detached automatically from the material extension. So, this comment that Ashanga Shastrena, with the Ashanga, detachment, shastrena, a weapon of detachment, dhrutena chidva. One can extract himself from the illusion of the material banyan tree. Prabhupada is purporting that this shastrena, this weapon of ashanga, of detachment, can be easily facilitated by the practice of Bhakti, Bhagavad Bhakti, devotional service to Sri Hari. In that way, one becomes attached to the activities of serving the Lord, such as hearing about the Lord, such as speaking about the Lord, such as glorifying the Lord, such as following the orders of the Lord, such as meditating on the Lord, remembering the Lord, serving the mission of the Lord, and in this way completely absorbing oneself in this variety of activities in connection with Sri Hari through seva. a Bhagavad Bhakti joke, one very easily detaches oneself from the influence of the material energy and one's sangha dosha, one's false association with the material world. And this is the easy process of Krishna consciousness, susukam kartum, as Krishna explains in the confidential section of Bhagavad Gita, Rajaguya, is susukam kartum. It is very, very easy, very joyfully performed. So in this way, by the application of Bhagavad Bhakti, one can very easily detach oneself from the false illusory position as indicated by the banyan tree analogy. Now in text number 7, text number 6, Krishna goes on now. He's encouraging very emphatically. He's advertising. He's very much advertising the wonderful circumstances, the wonderful qualities of the spiritual world to attract the conditioned souls from the material world back to return them in the spiritual existence. Krishna explains, Natad Bhasha Shate Shuryo Na Shashanka Napabakaha Yadgatvana Nirvatante Tadhama Paramamama. That supreme abode of mine is not illumined by sun, nor moon, nor by fire or electricity. Those who reach it never return to this material world. Prabhupada, in his humorous way, he goes on to further advertise and glorify the wonderful qualities of the spiritual world. What is this foolishness? Prabhupada speaks in 1975. Why should you pay the electric bill? Go there and live there. There is no need of electricity. Natad Bhasha Shate. It is in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains, Natad Bhasha Shate Surya. No need of the sun or the moon. It is the spiritual world is not lit by the sun or the moon because everyone is effulgent. Every planet is effulgent. So therefore there is no need of these things. There is no ignorance. There is no scarcity. There is no miserable condition. Just a place. What a place. Just to imagine. There's no need of recharging anything there. The living entities are all effulgent and fully transfused with transcendental energy. No question of fatigue or exhaustion or misery or any type of suffering. One's existence is fully on the surcharged spiritual level so that one can interact in a very dynamic and in a very emotional, a very full of flavorous way. It's called Bhakti Rash. One can interact in a very flavorious way with the Supreme Lord Sri Hari in affection and in Leela. And in this way one has an amazing body, as was explained earlier in Bhagavad Gita. Sa prayati samadbhavam, in the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, attaining the Supreme. Sa prayati, they attain samadbhavam, a nature like mine. And here Krishna is explaining more in more detail about the nature of the spiritual reality. Prabhupada in his purport is concluding that one should be captivated by this information. He should desire to transfer himself to the eternal world and extricate himself from this false reflection of reality. As we explained in the beginning of the lesson, verses 6 to 10 of this chapter explain in more detail the process of transmigration. Let's read and explore some of these verses. Text number 7, Sri Krishna explains. This is a very, very important verse, and we'll see many components of the verse are very useful in explaining the philosophy and preaching Krishna consciousness. Mamavangsha jivaloke jivabhuta shanatanaha manashashtanindriyani prakritishtani karshati. That Krishna first of all explains the actual identity of the living entity. Mama eva angsha. Mama eva angsha. The living entity is a part of God. Angsha means a part. So we are part of God because God is Advaita. There is nothing beyond God. Advaita means that He is without a second. That means God is everything. So we are also a God. We are a part of the creation of God, which is God. God is His creation and the simultaneously existing personality, as we explained in earlier verses of Bhagavad Gita, that Maya tatamidam savam jagadavyaktam muritina machstani sarvabhutani. Machstani sarvabhutani, this whole creation is simply his energy. Naham na chaham teshu avashtitaha, but he is not within his creation. So this God is everything, and matstani sarvabhutani, his presence is in all beings. So therefore his presence is also in us. So mama eva angsha, we are part of Krishna. We are Krishna. Mama is certainly mama eva angsha. Mama eva angsha jiva loke, the living entity is part of me. Jiva bhuta sanatanaha, and Prabhupada specifically emphasizes the significance of this word and statement, Jiva Bhuta Sanatanaha, indicating that the presence or the existence, the identity, is called Jiva Tatta. The truth of the living entity is that the living Jiva Bhuta Sanatanaha, the living entity exists eternally. So this statement in itself is sufficient to refute the malicious understanding or the malicious presentation of the Mayavadi philosophers, who will explain that the jiva was God, and the very concept of jiva means that one has forgotten his godliness, and jiva begins when we forget that we're God. And when we dissolve our jiva again, then we realize that we are one. This philosophy does fit many of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. This philosophy does address those in an appropriate way. We return to the spiritual consciousness. We're in an illusory circumstance. However, the fault with this particular philosophy, as Prabhupada is explaining in the purport to this verse, is that how does God forget? How can the Brahman forget that he's Brahman? In that case, there's something must be higher than the Brahman, which makes the Brahman forget. So that's called the truth of Maya. That illusion is higher than the Brahman. That's called the Mayavad, the truth of Maya. Mayavadi Bashushanile Hoy Sharavanasham. We do not accept this philosophy. And based on these true principles of the Bhagavad Gita, that Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, it's not that we were God and we've become Jiva. We're eternally Jiva. So even after liberation, we remain a separate being in order to enjoy Rasha, Bhakti Rosh, in order to have relationship and activity and feelings of affection can be enjoyed between the separate identities of the Jiva and the Ishvara. That's called Bhagavad Bhakti, which is the perfection of life, which is the constitutional position of the Jiva. Now, Krishna's explaining that eternal part of himself, that eternal fragment of the Jivatma, which has in this material existence, is mana shashtan indriyani. It is victimized or incarcerated by mana shashta indriya, a mind and six senses. And specifically, Krishna is explaining that these mind and six senses, mana shashtan indriyani prakritishtani karashati, they give a lot of trouble to the jiva. Actually, if you were to take a statistical type of analysis, the different ways that the knee, your knee, the different ways we can get pleasure from this knee, we can massage a little bit, we can move it, exercise a little bit. That's about all we can get. But if you were to examine the ways this knee could give you pain, we could go on for hours. We could be twisting it, we could be screwing it, we could be slicing it, we could be smashing it, we could be burning it. These senses have so much capacity to cause us pain. Manasha, and this is confirmed in this verse of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, that the mind, manashashta indriya, the mind and the six senses, karishati, they give a lot of trouble to the living entity who's prakritishtan, who's in this material nature. So this is the bargain that we foolishly agreed and signed contract to. That yes, I want to come to enjoy the senses, and we willingly accept and take shelter of the set of senses, being blind to the fact that these very senses and mind are designed to cause us suffering. And now Krishna goes on to explain how the jiva actually accepts the various types of bodies. Text number 8. Sharidam yadavapnoti yat chakri utkramatishvaraha grihitvatani shamyaiti vayurgandhani vashayat vayurgandhan. Eva, just like the wind carries, the vayur, the wind carries different gandha, different fragrances, different smells. Krishna is explaining the living entity in the material world carries his different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aroma. Thus he takes one kind of body and again quits it to take another. According to the subtle consciousness, just like the air, in this analogy Krishna is presenting the circumstance of the jiva is like the air. The jiva is pure, the jiva is transcendental. However, the air, it carries vayurgandhan. The air carries aromas. So we can smell the fragrance of in this time of year here in Sri Mayapur, we can smell the fragrance of the mangoes, the fragrance of the kartal, the sweet fruits which are bulging out of the sides of the trees. We can smell the fragrance of the different seasonal flowers, the goram kaler, full, like the champa and other types of flowers. So these fragrances are in the air. And so in the same way, the consciousness, it accepts an identity that I am, and a false ego, I am this, I am that. And on the basis of that subtle identity, Krishna explains, Srutram, Chakshu, Sparshanam Cha, Rashanam Grahanam Evacha, Adishtaya Manaschayam, Vishayan Upashevayat. That one attains a certain type of Shrotram, means the ears. Chakshu means the eyes. Sparshanam means sense of touch. Rasanam means a sense of taste. Granam means a sense of smell. And in this way, one gets a certain group of senses which are adishtaya mana. They are adishtaya, means that they are on the foundation, they are founded upon adishtaya mana, the mind. Whatever conception that the jiva has that he thinks I am, based on that conception or based on that set of desires that are unfulfilled and want to be fulfilled in the mind, unfulfilled desires, adishtaya mana, one will get a certain group of senses to fulfill those types of desires. Vishayan upashevayat. And in this way one enjoys the material world. So the jiva, it transmigrates from one body to another, flavoring, tasting the different flavors that the senses can provide, based on that conception that I am this body. And in this way the living entity accepts one body after another in this material world. Srila Prabhupada comments in his purports, once placed in some particular kind of body, he comes under the control of nature, because the body, being matter, acts according to the laws of nature. At that time, the living entity has no power to change that law. Suppose an entity is put into the body of a dog. As soon as he is put into the body of a dog, he must act like a dog. He cannot act otherwise. If the living entity is put into the body of a hog, then he is forced to eat stool and act like a hog. So in this way, one gets a certain set of senses. Vishayan upashevayat. Just like Prabhupada gives the example of the body of the dog. So the type of enjoyment that the dog enjoys, the human body, the human senses cannot relish that. The human senses will relish sweetly cooked rasgulla or gulab jalebi, hot from the ghee. The human senses are very refined, and the sweets or the bitter korela and hot rice, or the puri fried in ghee with some aloo and aloo mata sabji. The human sense, or smelling the agarbatti, or hearing the tabla, or hearing the mridanga, as Thakur Bhaktivinoda sings, that mridanga baddha shunite hoy abashara shara jache. I'm desiring to hear the mridanga. The human senses are very refined. The animal senses are very gross. They're unrefined. the dog's snout and tongue, and in this way the dog is therefore, those senses are designed for smelling all sorts of obnoxious things in the drainage, in the sewage, in the dead, the rotting carcass. So in this way, whatever type of body one gets, one is condemned to act in that way. So now we're in human life. If we act in a tamasic way and eat indiscriminately and behave in social interaction in an indiscriminate, inconsiderate, without the results of consequence, animalistic type way, then we may actually, just like animals, they don't consider the consequences of what they eat. They'll just simply be pulled by their senses. They never consider is this right or wrong. They're pulled by their senses and they'll just eat. So if we eat in that way, without consciousness, without discriminating, how should I, what's the price, how should I pay for this? What type of tapasya do I need to perform to be able to pay for the sins that I'm incurring? All of these questions that a sentient being will ask. Animals do not ask. So if we live our life in that way, in like on the level of an animal, we can take the birth in an animal species, and then we become completely condemned. Because we will simply become on the level of the dog. Because the senses will condemn us to behave in that way. And that is condemned life. So that's the great risk that we face in this human life. If we foolishly act in a irregular way, in a adharmic way, then we may find ourselves cast into a lower species, and in that way be for millenniums be condemned and lost in this material world until again we somehow or other reach back to the human form of life. So we have to be very careful to avoid that predicament. We don't know what karmas, what sins we have performed which could cause us to be condemned in such a circumstance. Therefore, we have to chant Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, the great mantra for deliverance. Kali Juge Nam Hoy Krishna Avatar, Nam Hoy Te Hoy Sarva Jagat Nishtar. As Krishna explained in the previous chapter, that Bhagavad Bhakti Jogena Sagunan Samatitaitam, specifically by chanting the names of Sri Hari, the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, we can transcend all of the influence of the material energy. Kali Doshan in He Rajan Ashta Eka Mahagunai, one great thing about the Kali Yuga, Kirtana Deva Krishna Sha. Kirtana Deva Krishna, by chanting the name of Krishna, Mukta Sangha. You can be liberated from the Sangha, from the association, from the contamination, from the all-around drowning effect of this material energy, Mukta. You can get delivered from that by Kirtanat Eva Krishna Sha, chanting the name of Krishna, Param Brajet, and attain the Supreme. So, whatever circumstances we're in, we should chant the name of Sri Hari to avoid the great risk here of falling down to a lower species of life and being condemned for millenniums of yugas until again we reach the human form of life in complete darkness. That could happen, and one has to be very cautious about how one lives one's life. The remaining verses of the chapter deal with Krishna's statement. Let's read text number 15, or another very important verse from this chapter, with many elements which are significant and very important in regard to the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, addressing many key philosophical questions. Sarvasya chaham ririshani vishtha matashmiti jnanam apohanam cha vedascha sasareva aham eva vedya vedanta kridreda vedeva chaham. Krishna is explaining that Sarvasya chaham ririshani vishtha, Ridi Shani Vishta, I am situated in the heart of Sarvasya, of all living beings. Matar, from me comes smritir jnanam apohanam. From me comes remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness, apohanam. And oftentimes we ask, why does Krishna make us forget? He makes us forget, he provides forgetfulness of our previous lives, forgetfulness of our eternal relationship with him. We become influenced, we forget, so that we can fully experience the illusion of this material world. If we were constantly remembering our previous lives, then we could never really become enamored by the illusory potency. We have to forget, so that we become completely merged into thinking this is the all in all. Asatyada satta kurimani, as Narottam Das Thakur sings. Asatyada satta kurimani. Those temporary things that we accept to be as true, because we have to forget the actual truth and the reality of our actual spiritual identity. Having forgotten that, then we accept this to be the ultimate reality. So in that way, this forgetfulness is an essential ingredient of us as Krishna, out of kindly for facilitating our desire to try to enjoy, to try to be the Lord, separate from Him, in order to fully try. He enables us to forget our actual spiritual identity, so that we can actually enjoy this material illusion. Vedas chasasara aham eva vedya, of all the Vedas I am to be known. And in this way, Prabhupada's explaining that one who knows Krishna, therefore knows all the Vedas. The commentary of Pujapad Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that verses 16 to 18 constitute the Trisloki Gita, the essence of the Vedas as described in 3 verses. Let's read these 3 verses. Text number 16. There are 2 classes of beings, the fallible and the infallible. In the material world, every living entity is fallible, and in the spiritual world, every living entity is called infallible. Besides these 2, there is the greatest living personality, the Supreme Soul, the imperishable Lord Himself, who has entered the 3 worlds and is maintaining them. Because I am transcendental beyond both the fallible and the infallible, because I am the greatest, I am celebrated in this world and in the Vedas as that Supreme Person. Text number 19. Janati Purushotam Shasharavid. Text number 19. Let's read. Yomam evam ashamudha janati purushotamam saravid bhajitimam sarvabhavena bharataham. One should submissively hear from Bhagavad Gita that these living entities are always subordinate to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Anyone who is able to understand this, according to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna knows the purpose of the Vedas. So when one understands that one is the servant of Krishna, and when one practices devotional service, so sarva vid, he is the knower of everything. Sarva bhajitimam sarva bhavena bharata. And he, sarva bhavena, with great devotion, with full devotional service, bhajitimam, he worships me. And in this way, Krishna concludes the 20th chapter of the Yoga, the Supreme Person, the shortest chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, with a very beautiful verse. Whoever knows me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without doubting, is the knower of everything. He therefore engages himself in full devotional service to me, O son of Bharat. And Prabhupada concludes in his purport. In this chapter, the first 5 verses describe the process of freeing oneself from the weakness of heart, and the rest of the chapter from the 6th verse through the end discuss Purushottam Yoga. As long as the living entity is in the dark material world, he is in conditional life, but as soon as he reaches the spiritual sky, by cutting through the false perverted tree of the material world, he becomes liberated. Then there is no chance of his coming back. In his conditional life, the living entity considers himself to be the Lord of the material world, but in his liberated state, he enters into the spiritual kingdom and becomes an associate of the Supreme Lord. And there he enjoys eternal bliss, eternal life, and full knowledge. That's called Purushottam Yoga, the Yoga of the Supreme Person. Jai Shri Prabhupada Ki.